You might not like Kamaru, but you cannot fucking deny that he's the greatest welterweight of all time. Can't deny it.
It's gonna start some.
Can't deny it. You can't deny it. You can't deny it.
I have to respectfully disagree with Dana here. Kamaru Usman, although one of the greatest welterweights of all time, he is not, without a doubt, the greatest above GSP. GSP is still the greatest welterweight of all time, and honestly, when we know all the context and everything that GSP and Kamaru Usman have done throughout their entire careers, it's not really even that close. We have a lot of recency bias because GSP has not fought in the welterweight division for a very long time. It's been since 2013. Kamaru Usman is still fighting in the UFC and last fought in the welterweight division in 2023. I argue GSP beat better competition, had much longer longevity, has more numbers to his record, has accomplished as a champion more than Usman has, and did one of the hardest things any champion can ever do, that is defeating 3 generations of fighters. This is something I've talked about and promoted many times as potentially the biggest challenge to any champion. Defeat 3 generations. There's only been a couple champions who have ever done it in UFC history, and GSP is one of them. Usman never did it. Usman lost to a guy in his generation twice, back to back. Leon Edwards is, of course, a very good fighter, but when we're talking about the greatest number 1 of all time, that kind of stuff can go against you. Now, on the other hand, GSP lost to Matt Serra, which is the biggest blemish of his career. And he lost to Matt Serra in his 15th professional fight. In Kamaru Usman's 15th fight, he defeated Rafa dos Anjos, the former lightweight champion, and one of the top-ranked welterweights in the world at the time. So the biggest thing against GSP is that loss to Matt Serra, but we do have to also know he avenged this loss dominantly in the rematch. In fact, GSP has beaten every single fighter he has ever fought, whereas Kamaru Usman has not. Kamaru Usman in the welterweight division does have that loss to Jose Caceres in his second professional fight, which we have to look at their entire careers. Now, that's not to take away too much from Usman because he wasn't even near his prime, but that didn't happen to GSP. GSP never lost to some random guy in the regional scene. Even that, right? The only guys he lost to were champions, Matt Hughes and Matt Serra. Serra got the belt from him, and he avenged both of those losses. Both of them. He beat Matt Hughes, in fact, twice after arguably the 3rd greatest welterweight of all time. He defeated him twice. He defeated Matt Serra, avenged that loss, and went on an historic run at welterweight as a champion. The second thing you could say against GSP is the fact that he has so many decision wins, but so did Kamaru Usman. That's the thing a lot of people don't take into consideration. Both fighters have a lot of wins by decision. It's just that recency bias about Usman's career, his KOs and TKOs, came much later in his career when he fought Gilbert Burns, Masvidal in the first Colby fight. The only other knockout he has in the UFC was against Sergio Moraes. He has finished 4 of his opponents in the UFC, whereas GSP has finished 8 through a much longer reign, defeating generation after generation of fighters. And the later generation in his career, it was much more difficult for him to finish those guys. Here are the notable achievements out of both fighters' careers at welterweight only. We're not talking about middleweight. They both did fight at middleweight, but we're talking about the greatest welterweight of all time. GSP was 19-2 in the UFC's welterweight division. Kamaru Usman was 15-2 in the UFC if you do not count his 2 wins in the Ultimate Fighter. If you count the 2 wins in the Ultimate Fighter, that would be 17-2. But those were not professional fights and they were 2 rounds. So it's going to come down to your interpretation. GSP ultimately had a better record just by the numbers than Kamaru Usman did. That's number 1. Number 2, GSP was a 2-time welterweight champion. Kamaru Usman was a 1-time welterweight champion, and they both lost their belts. GSP was able to regain his belt. Kamaru Usman lost when he tried. Now, it was a much more difficult opponent with Leon Edwards than GSP defeating Matt Serra. Next, title defenses. Both guys reigned for a considerable amount of time. GSP has 9 consecutive title defenses as the welterweight champion. Kamaru Usman had 5 title defenses, nearly half of GSP's. GSP had 12 title wins in welterweight title fights. Kamaru Usman had 6, half of GSP's. GSP was a welterweight champion from December of 2007 to November of 2013, almost exactly 6 years on top. Kamaru Usman was the champion from March of 2019 to August of 2022. About 3.5 years as the champion. And now we look at the individual fighters. How many champions did these guys beat? GSP defeated Carl Parisian, who was the WEC welterweight champion, however you want to count that. He defeated Sean Shirk, who was the lightweight champion. He beat BJ Penn twice, who was the lightweight and welterweight champions. He defeated Matt Hughes twice, who was the welterweight champion. He defeated Matt Serra, who was the welterweight champion. He defeated Jake Shields, who was the middleweight Strikeforce champion and the Elite XC welterweight champion. champion. He defeated Carlos Condit, who was the interim welterweight champion. Nick Diaz was a Strikeforce welterweight champion. And he defeated Johnny Hendricks, who later became the UFC welterweight champion. We look at Kamaru Usman now. Kamaru Usman beat Leon Edwards, who will later become the UFC welterweight champion. Sean Strickland, who later becomes the middleweight UFC champion. He defeated Rafa dos Anjos, who was the lightweight champion. Tyron Woodley was the welterweight champ. Colby Covington was the interim champ, and he defeated him twice. GSP has more credentialed opponents on his resume compared to Kamaru Usman. Now, who beat the better fighters for their era? I argue that still goes under GSP, with the likes of BJ Penn in his prime, John Fitch in his prime, he defeated Matt Hughes, Jake Shields in his prime, Carlos Condit in his prime, Nick Diaz in his prime, Johnny Hendricks in his prime, without USADA, whereas Kamaru Usman did defeat Colby Covington twice, which were big wins. He defeated Gilbert Burns, and he defeated Tyron Woodley in his prime as well, right? Those are big wins for Kamaru Usman, and you might be able to count Jorge as well. It depends where you rank him in terms of skills and all that stuff. But when you look at the other fighters, RDA was out of his prime and he wasn't a real welterweight. That was definitely later shown. You could probably count Damian Maia. Sean Strickland was way before his prime. So was Leon Edwards. Now, regarding cleaning out their divisions, both Kamaru Usman and GSP at some point in their careers had cleaned out their divisions. Dana's claim that Kamaru did it twice did not really happen. The only reason anybody would say that was because he beat Colby twice and beat Jorge twice. And at the time he beat Colby the second time, he also did beat Gilbert Burns. That's not cleaning out your division. What Alexander Pantoja is doing right now is cleaning out your division, where you're beating everybody in the top 10. Usman did not beat everybody in the top 10. There was one point in his career where he got close to doing that. GSP has done that as well, though. Now, when we talk about rankings, the UFC didn't have an official ranking system until like the end of GSP's reign. But if you look at other media sources, such as Bleacher Report, MMA Fighting, and various others, from 2007 all the way to 2013, in hindsight, GSP has defeated the majority of the top 10 for 6 years straight. You could look at the entire history year after year, and GSP would have wins over multiple of them throughout all of those 6 years. I think there was only like 1 year in there in like 2013 where he didn't beat the majority of the top 10. I think he beat 4 of them out of the top 10 at the end of his career, when the ranked fighters got recycled with newer talent, with guys like Robbie Lawler, Matt Brown, Rory McDonald, etc. Saying that Kamaru cleaned out his division twice because he beat Colby twice and Jorge twice, as well as beating Gilbert Burns, is like saying that GSP cleaned out his division twice when he beat Matt Hughes, BJ Penn, and Josh Koscheck. Then what about the other time when he beat Matt Serra, John Fitch, BJ Penn, Thiago Alves, Dan Hardy, Josh Koscheck, and Jake Shields, all back-to-back to each other like that? That would be the second time he cleaned out his division. I think it's pretty unanimous as to why Georges St Pierre is the greatest welterweight of all time, right? When we're talking about number 1 and number 2, because that's where I rank them, I put GSP at number 1, I put Kamaru Usman at number 2. Everything is going to be taken into consideration here. GSP has the more accomplishments as a champion. He has more finishes. He has more wins. He has a better record. More title defenses, more title wins, won the belt more times, beat more credentialed opponents. Usman did do very well in beating multiple ranked fighters, but so did GSP for many more years. And above all else, GSP defeated 3 generations of fighters. They are number 1 and number 2, but I honestly don't think it's too close. I think it's kind of concrete that GSP is ahead of Kamaru Usman. I think a bigger debate would be between who's the second greatest between Usman and Matt Hughes. I think that's a better debate than arguing between Usman and GSP. Because what Matt Hughes is able to do throughout his career was astounding. And he has similar kind of numbers as a champion to Kamaru Usman. And he defeated some great fighters throughout his career. He had more title defenses than Usman, same consecutively. And he had more title wins than Usman. And you can even argue with the whole competition thing between them two. I think Matt Hughes and Kamaru Usman is a way better debate to have for the second greatest than debating between Usman and GSP for number 1.